Before we start, do the quick roll call our rivals use, and that actually helps this story. Tell me in the comments what city you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Keep your clock in mind. In this case, the difference between 9:15 and 9:20 decides who owns a woman's evening. If our heroine refuses the virtue bond visit, a letter marked Bond Compliance lands on her foreman's desk at 9:20 a.m., and her next pay packet shrinks to fund someone else's rights over her time. The river mill looked honest from the outside. Tall windows, brick warm from the boilers, a whistle that cut the town into shifts. Inside, the books told a different story. Wages rounded down to the penny. Canteen deductions no one remembered agreeing to. And a new line item that arrived the month a Northern Trust company opened a desk over the bank. The line read, Virtue Bond. The company pamphlet called it The Modern Protection of Domestic Honor, underwritten by reputable gentlemen and redeemable upon honorable marriage. That was 10 words hiding one machine. The bond was a scrip account tied to a woman's pay and to a packet of coupons with serial numbers. Each coupon carried a little space for a cabinet photograph, a doctor's blind seal, and a notary circle. A donor could sponsor a bond by buying a set of coupons from the trust and, on paper, pledging to never redeem them. In practice, the donor traded the coupons to foremen, landlords, and certain club stewards. Every coupon was good for an evening, and the trust paid handling fees when a coupon returned with all boxes stamped. Clara Finch folded thread into bobbins on the 3rd floor and kept a ledger of her own in a flour tin. 22, steady hands, a church dress that fit because she made it herself, and a fiancé who worked the river winch. She and Will planned to sign their license at the courthouse and rent a room above the feed store that had a window and a chair that did not wobble. On a Monday, the pay clerk slid her packet under the grill with an extra sheet on top. The sheet said the trust had issued a virtue bond in Clara's name for her protection and comfort. It said deductions would be light and temporary. It said the bond would mature upon marriage with a reassuring letter to her husband. It also said that while under bond, Clara should attend routine compliance nights for certification. The clerk called it modern wisdom and pointed his pencil at the line for signature. Clara asked where the bond money sat. He said in the trust, safe as pewter cups. She asked who held the coupons. He said the trust's agent and certain gentlemen designated as sponsors. The pencil hovered. She did not sign. He frowned and said a refusal might trigger a notice to the foreman for workplace order. He tapped the clock on the wall like the hour could bully a pen. May Donovan saw the same machine from the side that always tells the truth. Mail sacks, stamps, and minutes. She was the postal inspector assigned to these river and rail towns because letters had begun to arrive with soft language and hard outcomes. Bond compliance, reassurance of character, notice of redemption. None demanded cash, all demanded schedule. Last week she had opened a crate labeled spools that held a hand die with the trust's wreath crest, bundles of red wax, and a stack of blank compliance slips with spaces for doctor, notary, and photograph. The return address was a law office that rented a back room to the trust's agent. That is how schemes like this stay clean until you follow the route. The bank rents the desk, the lawyer rents the stamp, the club rents the room, and the mill rents the idea of protection. Clara took the leaflet to the top floor and laid it on the table in front of the 3 women who actually ran the building between whistles. Aunt Meg, who kept the key to the supplies cage, on a ribbon. Sarah Jane, who knew every landlady in town and which ones kept ledgers straight, and an old spinner named Mrs. Hale, who never raised her voice and never forgot a number. Clara said the trust wanted to insure her virtue. Mrs. Hale said, if a man wants to insure something that does not belong to him, check whose name is on the payout. They read the small print together. A sponsor could redeem a coupon by presenting a filled card and a note from a notary that the evening had been spent in domestic supervision or in wholesome fireside company. A photographed likeness of the bondholder would be affixed to the coupon to prevent fraud. A clinic visit was recommended before first redemption to avoid misunderstandings. Clara did not blush. She put her finger on one word. Recommended. Mrs. Hale nodded. Recommended becomes required the minute no one is looking. The trust's agent was a clean man called Martin Vale, who wore a gray hat and a smile that made people feel like they had already agreed. He set up on the bank's mezzanine with 3 tools, a small hand press with a wreath, a blank book of bond numbers, and a wire rack for coupons printed on heavy card. He told the mill owners they were pioneers of respect. He told church deacons they were guardians of domestic peace. He told landlords there would be fewer scenes in hallways. He told Clara nothing directly. He had the mill do that. At lunch, the foreman pinned a notice by the stair. Compliance night this Thursday, 7 o'clock, at the Union Hall. Bondholders will attend so the trust can send reassurances to appropriate parties. The Union Hall had a side door no union man used. On compliance nights, a club steward set out a velvet cord, a shallow tray for tickets, and a tray for pocket watches, because time was now an instrument. A photographer dragged his cabinet camera to the hall and set up his light. A factory doctor with a blind seal sat at a small table in the corner where women did not want to look. A notary waited with a circle punch that left a ring in red wax. No one called it anything ugly. They called it certifying a promise. A donor could enter with a sponsor coupon, hand it to the steward, and be introduced to the bondholder for wholesome company. 2 hours later, he would leave with the coupon stamped Dr. Seen, photograph affixed, and notary witnessed. The trust would count that as a redeemed evening and move money on its books. Clara did not plan to let a coupon decide her night. She and Mrs. Hale went to the hall in daylight and asked to see the room for a church supper. The steward, happy to be useful and to hear the word church, unlocked the door and left them alone for 5 minutes. Clara took in the props like a machinist catalogs parts. A table with slips already pre-printed with the trust's crest. A cigar box with copper number tabs and a little brass loop to hang them on a card. A screen in the corner tall enough to stage discretion. A small hand mirror on a chair, because even dressed righteousness checks its hair. She did not touch anything. She stood behind the screen and looked where a camera would point. Most men would stand in the doorway. Most women would be sat on the bench. The camera would catch a face and a tab. She saw a nail in the baseboard hidden by the screen leg and marked the wood with the edge of her thimble, a shallow crescent you could find with a fingertip. Mrs. Hale turned the small hand mirror face down so any later photograph would show a dark oval in the corner. One more way to identify the room if someone tried to say the picture had been taken elsewhere. Donovan spent those same 5 minutes at the printer's quarter where dies and numberers are made for cash and no questions. She asked for receipts. The printer produced a ledger that showed the trust's wreath die in March and a second die in May labeled travel use. The same donor club paid for both. She bought wax scrap impressions from each die. The May die left a shallow shoulder, cheap iron that printed soft on rough paper. She put the scraps in an envelope and wrote one sentence a judge would like. Replacement die ordered after first use, paid by donors, not the mill account. Then she walked 3 doors down to the photographer's shop and asked for the scrap tray where studio names go when clients demand privacy. He handed over a little paper nest. Inside lay curls with the letters Uni and On H from Union Hall. She did not make him say what everyone knew, that clients scraped his mark-off cards and pressed their own. The curls would do. Thursday came fast. At 6:55 p.m., Clara stood on the corner across from the Union Hall in a plain work dress and a shawl. She had 2 things in her pocket, a small brass awl a locksmith had sold her for lacework, and a red thread she had pulled from her own hem. She was not there to start a scene. She was there to mark a route. When the steward opened the door, she walked in with the other workers like she had been sent, which she had. The room was exactly as she had left it, except now it had a smell of wax and coal oil and men pretending not to watch. The photographer stood ready. The doctor pretended to read. The notary fanned himself with bond numbers. The steward called names from a list. When he said Finch, a man in a decent coat stepped forward with a sponsor coupon already signed. He did not look at Clara like a person looks at a person. He looked at the coupon like a cashier looks at a coin. The steward fitted a copper tab with the number 14 into a brass loop and hung it on the coupon. The number would match a ticket on the bench. The bench had a card tacked to the back. Clara pretended to adjust her shawl and pressed her awl into the underside of the card, one tiny bite by the left nail. The steward led the donor to the photographer first. The camera took a likeness. The studio name would be scraped later, and the trust's crest would be pressed on the empty space to make the card look official. Then the steward steered the pair toward the corner where the doctor waited with his blind seal. "Quick check," he said, as if it were nothing. Clara stepped behind the screen and tied the red thread to the hinge with a double knot. The doctor did not see because he did not look. He pinched the seal into a blank and called it hygienic. The notary pressed his circle into red wax and wrote, "Witnessed wholesome company." The wording would travel farther than any photograph. At 9:12, the steward's runner left by the side door with a canvas pouch that did not bear a federal lead. It contained coupons stamped and ready for redemption at the bank window, and 3 letters, one to a foreman, one to a landlord, and one to a fiancé. The outer faces were the same, bond compliance and reassurance of character. The runner headed for the depot because the trust liked to piggyback its mail into the federal sack at the last minute under the smile of courtesy. Donovan stood at the counter when he arrived. The postmaster tapped the book with his pen. Book first. He wrote 920, lifted the mouth, and slid out a little card the trust liked to tuck under the cord. Family Dispatch. He tied a federal lead that bit clean. He placed the fiancé letter in a marshal's hold sack and logged it. He handed the employer letter back to the runner with a printed notice clipped to it that read, "Not valid for mail," above a sample of the trust's crest. He set the landlord letter in an evidence tin with the shallow ring impression from the travel die pinned on top. 3 different fates for 3 letters. Paper learns its place when a room insists. At 9:25, the bank window paid out a handling fee for a redeemed coupon with all boxes filled. Vail, the agent, smiled and called it order. The trust wrote numbers in a book. The donor tipped his hat at the steward and left without a stain on his name. The mill foreman read an outer phrase on an envelope and decided to move Clara to a station near the stair where fewer men would see her. Will, working a late winch on the river, heard 2 words from a man on the dock, "bonded girl," and tasted iron in his mouth. He did not throw anything. He wrote a minute in his head so someone could use it later. Clara went home and set the awl and the red thread knot in a tin with her flour money and wrote a line under the day. "If a coupon can price my evening, I can price the route that moves it." She expected the trust to call the night proper and put a stamp on it. She intended to put a mark on their stamp and bring it back to the room where a clock would not lie. Donovan started with tools, not morals. She put 3 things in motion before noon. First, a control envelope printed on the trust stock with the wreath crest and the Latin motto, "Missing a comma." Second, a tiny witness nick punched into the rim of the standard wreath, die she had seized from a misrouted crate the week before. Third, a list of rooms where paper tried to look like law. She went to the printer's quarter. The die maker pulled a ledger at her request. March, wreath die, paid by the River Improvement Association. May, travel die, same design, paid cash by Mill Patrons Club. Same men, different names when it suited them. She paid for scrap impressions from both dies. The March die left a clean shoulder. The May die bled at the edge on rough stock. She wrote 1 sentence on the envelope flap for later. Second die purchased after mark. At the photographer's, she asked for the scrap tray where studio names went when clients wanted privacy. He handed her a paper nest. In it lay curls that read Uni and On H from Union Hall. She slid them into a glass-signed sleeve with the date. He did not want to be a villain. He wanted to be paid and left out of trouble. She paid for a contact print of last night's plate before he scraped it. A bench, a screen, a copper-numbered tab hanging from a loop. Clara in profile, a deep shadow where a small mirror had been turned face down. Clara spent her morning where schemes show seams, the bank. The trust's agent, Martin Vale, had a window off the mezzanine. Behind him on a shelf sat a wire rack for coupons, a shallow tray for red wax sticks, and a slim book titled Bond Numbers. She asked him to explain the bond to her, like to a cousin. He smiled and said the bond made marriage smoother and work calmer. He said a sponsor could never redeem a coupon for anything unwholesome. He did not say what wholesome meant. She asked who held the coupons tonight. He said trusted gentlemen at the Union Hall for the convenience of order. She looked down as if shy and memorized the serial written on the top coupon of the rack. Mrs. Hale handled the landladies. She took tea with 2 who knew everything and told nothing for free. The first said the trust was a blessing because it kept fellows from lingering on stairs. The second said the trust wrote her a letter about a boarder that made her stomach turn. The outer face had said reassurance of character, as if the house needed reassurance. The inner face had said the bondholder would be occupied 2 evenings a month and should be permitted a flexible curfew. Mrs. Hale asked to see the envelope. The landlady produced it and blinked when Mrs. Hale didn't open it. The crest on the outside had done all the talking. Mrs. Hale rubbed the ring with her thumb and felt a shallow shoulder. Cheap iron. She noted the minute on the mantel clock because watches are stubborn witnesses. Will Pike went where paper turns to cash, the back of the Union Hall and the alley behind the printer. He delivered flour to the cafe next door and used the receipt as his reason to linger. At 9:48, the lamppost by the hitch rail flickered. At 9:52, a launch chain rattled on the river behind the warehouses. At 10:03, 2 men in caps carried a satchel through the printer's side door. At 10:10, the men left without it. Will wrote those minutes on the back of the flower receipt and stuck it in his cap. He did not try to be brave. He tried to be exact. Donovan checked the clinic. The doctor who pinched a blind seal at the hall kept regular hours in a 2-room office over a pharmacy. On his desk lay a stack of blank slips with the trust crest at the top and 3 boxes at the bottom. Seen, fit, observed. She asked him when he wrote observed. He said when a chaperone sat in the room. She asked him who qualified as chaperone. He said the steward or a sponsor. She asked him if he had ever sealed blanks in advance to help the evening. He said sometimes. She did not praise his efficiency. She wrote it down. Next stop, the notary. He had a good desk and a worse habit. He set the wreath hand press on the blotter like a friend and his own desk stamp beside it like a badge. Donovan pressed each into scrap. A proper notary ring left a heavy bite. The trust ring printed soft on coarse paper. She asked for his registry of acknowledgments tied to bonds. He turned the book so she could read a line that showed up too often. Filed and recognized. Fee remitted by patrons. She asked him to name a statute that made a bond compliance letter an instrument with force over a worker's schedule. He answered with a haircut and called it domestic peace. She wrote, "Bond letters are levers, not law." Clara and Aunt Meg visited the feed store to ask a favor of the telegraph boy. If a satchel moved from the printer to the bank's back door tonight, could he send a one-line message to the post office desk? Satchel at 10:10. He said yes because Aunt Meg had mended his mother's window in winter for free, and a town remembers that kind of thing. Clara bought a spool of red thread while she was there, because a mark is easier to spot when it repeats. The steward at Union Hall made a mistake that saves women more often than courage does. He bragged. He told a barber that the mill ladies felt safer in his supervised room than in any parlor, and that the trust paid him to keep order. The barber told a baker. The baker told the auxiliary matron who kept church linens. The matron walked into the hall with a cloth over her arm and walked out with red wax grit on her glove. She came to the post office and set the glove on the counter and said only one sentence. "My closet is not for this." Donovan built the chain of custody before anyone argued feelings. She put the standard wreath die with her witness Nick into a tin and clipped a fresh impression to the lid. She put the travel die into a second tin with a scrap labeled "Shallow Shoulder." She placed the studio curls Uni on H into a small envelope. She labeled the landlady's envelope "Shallow Ring, Outer Face Only." She signed the cards and wrote the minutes that matched Will's receipt. Paper that carries time makes speeches short. The trust moved to the next page of its playbook. It issued a notice on the millboard. Any bondholder who failed to appear at compliance night would be marked non-cooperative, and a letter would be sent to the employer for record. Clara read it and breathed once slowly. She asked Mrs. Hale if missing the night would help or hurt. Mrs. Hale said, "You cannot win a game you do not score." She told Clara to go, collect what could be held in a hand, and make the room testify. Clara went to the dressmaker's oil stove and warmed a needle. She pricked the underside of her left cuff and fed the new red thread through it so she could pull a foot-long strand fast without looking. She tucked the brass awl into her sleeve. She walked to the hall with the other women at the hour a bell does its work on a town. At 7, the steward began in the tone of a man who thinks the room is his. Names, numbers, coupons, tabs, a sponsor with a decent coat, a coupon with a wreath. The copper tab 14 hung on a loop, a bench with a card tacked to it. Clara let her shawl slip and pressed the awl into the underside of the card by the left nail. She tied the red thread to the hinge of the screen in a double knot and let the tail fall where a cabinet camera would see it only if someone later looked hard. The doctor pinched his blind seal into a blank before anyone's eyes adjusted. The photographer took a likeness with the mirror turned face down. The notary wrote, "Witnessed wholesome company," on red wax. The steward checked his tally. The coupon walked from table to table like a person being certified and became money by increments. At 9:12, the runner slipped through the side door with the canvas pouch and a card tucked under the cord. Family Dispatch. He trotted toward the depot to slide it into a federal sack under the smile called courtesy. The telegraph boy sent the one line as he passed, "Satchel at 10:10. The postmaster tapped the book with his pen when the runner arrived. Book first. He wrote 9:20, lifted the mouth, and slid the Family Dispatch card into a separate tray so it could not pretend to be a seal. He tied a federal lead with a clean bite. He placed the fiancé letter into a marshal's hold sack. He handed the employer letter back to the runner with a printed notice clipped to it that read, "Not valid for mail," above a sample impression of the trust crest. He put the landlord letter in an evidence tin and pinned to it the shallow ring impression that matched the travel die. 3 fates, 1 route, a clock. Vail smiled at the bank window when the coupon returned, stamped in all the little boxes. He wrote a handling fee into a column and told himself a story about order. The donor drew his cuff down over his wrist as if that could hide the ring impression on the coupon's edge. The steward put away his tray. The photographer scraped Union Hall off a card and reached for the wreath press. Donovan's control envelope with the missing comma sat on his table next to the hand press because she had sent it to him in a bundle the day before with a polite note asking for federal assistance with morning distribution. He pressed it without looking. His mouth supplied the comma, his hand could not. That was the point. By morning, Donovan had what she needed for a public demonstration that even careful men could not talk away. A Mark Standard die and a shallow twin. Wax impressions labeled in pencil. A control envelope with a motto missing a comma, now bearing the wreath pressed by the photographer's hand. A landlady's envelope with a shallow ring. Studio curls that spelled Union Hall. A contact print showing a red thread tail by a screen hinge, and the bench card edge with a small bite where a shawl had slipped. The printer's ledger with 2 invoices paid by patrons. A doctor's confession that blanks were sealed in advance. A notary's ledger line that said, "Fee remitted by patrons." A steward's tally with coupon serials. A bank book line that called a redeemed evening a handling fee. She booked the demonstration for 9:20 in the post office, same minute as the pouch. She asked the auxiliary matron to sit in front with gloves on. She sent notices to the mill, the bank, the trust's agent, the Union Hall steward, the photographer, the notary, the clinic, and 2 landlords who had received reassurance of character. The notice did not use adjectives. It said the federal office would review the status of private crests used in mail and the practice of delivering Family Dispatch cards in place of seals. It invited anyone with a bond number to see how the route worked. Clara did the last thing that turns a scheme into a map. She put the cuff with the red thread back on, pocketed the brass awl, and wrote the bench number 14 on a scrap. She folded the scrap around a pin from Aunt Meg's ribbon and stuck it through her dress hem so the number would travel with her body, whether or not anyone in a coat liked it. Then she went to work like any other morning and waited for a clock to do what clocks do when someone refuses to look away. The post office doors latched at 9:19, not drama, chain of custody. Donovan laid the table as a route, not a display. Left edge, the standard wreath die with her tiny witness Nick on the rim. Beside it, the shallow travel die. Each had a fresh wax impression on a card labeled in pencil. Center, the notary's desk stamp and a scrap showing its deeper ring. The control envelope with the Latin motto, missing a comma, and the trust crest freshly pressed by the photographer. The studio curls that spelled Union Hall in a glassine sleeve. Right edge, the landlady's envelope with the shallow ring, the steward's coupon tally, the printer's 2 invoices paid by Mill Patrons Club, the clinic blanks with the boxes seen, fit, observed, the bank book line marked handling fee, and a contact print of last night's plate with the red thread tail at the screen hinge and the small bite under the bench card. The auxiliary matron took the front chair, gloves on. The postmaster set his pen on the scale book. The clock clicked to 9:20. The runner came in carrying a canvas pouch bound with a brass cinch and a cream card tucked under the cord that read Family Dispatch. He moved to place it behind the scale, as if courtesy could turn a side shelf into a federal sack. The postmaster tapped the ledger. Book first. He wrote 9:20 in a square hand, slid the Family Dispatch card out from the cord, lifted the mouth, and poured 3 envelopes onto the blotter. Employer, landlord, fiancé. All with the wreath crest. The fiancé letter went into a marshal's hold sack with a federal lead that bit clean. The employer letter went back across the counter with a printed notice clipped to the outer face that read, "Not valid for mail," beneath a sample of the wreath. The landlord letter went into an evidence tin with the shallow ring scrap pinned to the lid. 3 fates, 1 route, no speeches. Martin Vale stood to the side with the trust book under his arm and a steady smile. The Union Hall steward hovered by the door, hands behind his back. The photographer held his hat and did not meet anyone's eyes. The doctor from the clinic stood with his blind seal on a cord. The notary rested his fingertips on the desk stamp like it could lend him backbone. 2 landlords and a foreman who had received reassurance of character edged closer. Will Pike stood by the wall with a flower receipt folded in his cap. Donovan started with metal. She pressed the standard die into warm wax. Clean shoulder. The tiny nick printed into the ring. She pressed the shallow twin. Soft edge, slight bleed on coarse stock. She set both cards in front of the notary and asked him to match the rings to the envelopes on the table. He picked the clean ring for the trust letters, the shallow for the landladies. The auxiliary matron leaned forward. She said, "We do not take family mail." The notary called it courtesy. The postmaster pointed at the placard above the counter. Not valid for mail. A public room does not recognize private crests. Next, images. Donovan slid the contact print into a wooden frame and tilted it toward the front row. The camera had caught Clara in profile on the bench card edge with a small bite, and the screen hinge with a red thread tail hanging just inside the shadow. She asked the photographer to say where the plate was exposed. He said Union Hall. She asked who pressed the trust crest over his studio name after printing. He said the notary brought a hand press and did it at his table. She set the studio curls Uni and on H beside the plate. Scraped names turn into evidence when men stop pretending not to see the curls. The doctor tried to save the medical layer. He said his slips protected workers from rumor. Donovan handed him one of his blank forms with the 3 boxes at the bottom. She asked him when he marked observed. He said when a chaperone sat in the room. She asked who counted as chaperone. He said steward or sponsor. She asked whether he had sealed blanks in advance to help the evening move. He said sometimes. The auxiliary matron said out loud what the room had already seen. Your seal moves faster than sight. The Union Hall steward tried to move the ground to manners. He said ladies felt safer under supervision and that he kept order for the trust. Donovan put his coupon tally on the table and pointed to the cereals that matched the trust rack. Numbers followed a path. Cereal to bench, to cabinet, to blind seal, to notary ring, to pouch, to bank. She handed the tally to the bank clerk, who compared it to the handling fee column. The clerk read the sequence with a face that had been trained to like sequences until this morning. Coupon 47, fee paid. Coupon 52, fee paid. Coupon 61, fee pending. Money does not hide when the book is open on the table. Will Pike gave his minutes like a man who knows a winch will punish any lie. Lamppost flicker at 9:48. Launch chain at 9:52. Printer's side door at 10:03. Men exit at 10:10 without a satchel. The printer's ledger matched the delivery hour for the travel die. The telegraph boy's one-line note sat under the ledger like a quiet nail. Vail called that coincidence. Donovan read the bank's handling fee time with the same calm voice. Numbers met numbers. If coincidence wants to live, it needs the clock to drift. The clock did not drift. The notary tried to make the room small again by saying domestic peace and respectable sponsors. Donovan took the control envelope with the missing comma and set it under the lamp. She asked the notary to read the motto around the wreath. He read it with a pause his eyes did not see. She asked whether he had ever carried the wreath press overnight. He said the trust trusted him. She asked whether donors had paid his filing fees. He said patrons supported order. She wrote one short line on a card and spoke it so the landlords would hear it clean. Bond letters are levers, not law. A landlord stepped forward unasked and placed his unopened envelope on the blotter. He said the outer face had been enough to move a girl's curfew. He said he had not read the inside because the crest had done the talking. Donovan put his envelope next to the landlady's with the shallow ring. Same outer phrase, different ring depth. She pressed the shallow twin into scrap so the soft shoulder stood next to the hard one. Then she pointed to the placard again. Envelopes that look like orders do not ride in a federal bag. Vail tried a different door. He said the trust had prevented scenes in stairwells and kept men from lingering. The auxiliary matron lifted her gloved hand. She set a church glove on the table with 2 faint red wax grains stuck to the fingers and said one sentence. My closet is not for this. A small object can move a room further than loud words. The steward's runner tried to leave by the side door with another pouch. The express boy stood in the frame and shook his head once. Book first. The runner set the pouch down like it was hot. The postmaster wrote 9:36, lifted the mouth, and found 3 more envelopes and a handful of copper number tabs with punched holes. Donovan slid 3 tabs onto a brass loop from the steward's tray and clinked them together so the sound would stick. She wrote copper identifiers used to tie women to cards. The sound did more work than any adjective. Donovan kept the center tight. She did not accuse sponsors of sins. She read instruments and roots. She listed, aloud and slow, what the room could see and what each item did. Standard die with witness nick. Travel die with shallow shoulder. Notary desk stamp with deeper ring. Control envelope with missing comma under the trust wreath. Studio curls Union H. Clinic blanks with boxes sealed in advance. Coupon tally matching bank fees. Family dispatch cards used in place of seals. landlord and employer letters with schedule language on the outside so a hallway could do the work. She did not raise her voice. She let the pile talk. A mill foreman asked out loud what everyone else tried not to ask. If a girl refuses a bond, will the trust write my office anyway? Vale said yes, for order. The foreman looked at the placard and at the marshal's sack and did a small but important thing. He tore up the outer face of the notice he had received yesterday and put the pieces in the waste tin. Donovan did not thank him. She logged the act. The judge was not in the room, but the law was. Donovan asked the marshal for custody. The marshal said, "Bring the tins." She put the standard die and its fresh impression into one tin, the shallow twin and its scrap into another. She wrapped the contact print, labeled the frame, and logged the studio curls. She tied the runner's ledger with blue tape and clipped a chain card to it. She placed the notary's scrap impression in a sleeve and wrote ring depth heavier. She set the 3 copper tabs and the brass loop in a bag. She put the landlady's envelope and the landlord's envelope in separate tins and wrote shallow ring and hard ring on the cards. She had the postmaster sign each card and write the minute. Then she did the thing that turns a demonstration into a hearing. She read a short notice in a clear voice. The federal office will present these instruments and this route tomorrow at 2 o'clock in the Harbor Commission Room. Subjects' names will be sealed. Buyers, officers, clerks, sponsors, and agents will be named. The questions are simple. Who bought the dies? Who pre-sealed the blanks? Who used the mail as a lever? Bring your books. Vale asked for the dies back to close out his desk. The marshal said no and clipped the tins shut. The notary asked whether the court would keep his stamp. Donovan said the court would test it and return it if it had behaved. The doctor asked if he could keep seeing patients. Donovan said yes and wrote him as a material witness on seal before sight. The postmaster pulled a placard from under the counter and tacked it higher on the wall with fresh brass heads. Not valid for mail. The auxiliary matron asked for the offcut when the case was over. The photographer asked if he could keep shooting if he left his name on his cards. Donovan said yes. He nodded and looked like a tradesman who had just found the rule he could live with. Clara stood by the door with Aunt Meg and Mrs. Hale, and the red thread still in her cuff. She did not speak. She looked at the bench bite, the thread tail in the photograph, the copper tabs, the dies, the envelopes, and the placard. The steward stared at the floor. Vale watched the tins leave like a man who had believed a crest could make minutes obey. The clock over the boxes clicked to 9:47. Donovan signed the last chain card and wrote the dull line that ends a chapter even before a judge lifts a pen. Route closed for private use pending court. The Harbor Commission Room was built for ledgers and long tables, not speeches. Bare windows, a clock that kept true time. The judge opened with 3 lines that set the ground. Subjects' names will be sealed. Buyers, officers, clerks, sponsors, and agents will be named. Show me steps, tools, and minutes. Donovan laid the route the same way she had at the post office so no one could pretend confusion. Left edge, the standard wreath die with her tiny witness nick on the rim. Beside it, the shallow travel die. Each had a fresh wax impression on a card labeled in pencil. Center, the notary's desk stamp with a scrap showing its deeper ring, the control envelope with the Latin motto missing a comma, and the trust crest freshly pressed by the photographer, the glassine sleeve of studio curls that spelled Union Hall, a contact print of the hall showing the bench card's small bite and the red thread tail at the screen hinge. Right edge, the runner's ledger with 920 entries in the same square hand for 3 mornings. The printer's invoices for March and May paid by the Mill Patrons Club. The clinic blanks with boxes seen, fit, observed, the steward's coupon tally, the bank ledger line marked handling fee, one landlord's and one landlady's unopened envelopes bearing reassurance of character, 3 copper-numbered tabs and a brass loop, and the Cream family dispatch card the trust slid under pouch cords. Chain of custody cards ran along the front like mile markers, each with time and initials. The clock ticked. Gloves on for anyone who touched metal or paper. The trust sent its faces. Agent Martin Vale with the slim bond book, the Union Hall steward in a clean coat, the clinic doctor with his blind seal on a cord, the notary with counsel, the photographer with his hat in his hands, 2 landlords and a mill foreman who had acted on outer phrases. The auxiliary matron took the front chair. Clara Finch sat between Aunt Meg and Mrs. Hale. Will Pike stood near the door with a folded receipt in his cap. The judge asked one question. How did these men use the mail to move minutes? Donovan started with metal because metal does not lie. She pressed the standard die into warm wax in full view. Clean shoulder. The tiny nick printed at the rim. She pressed the shallow travel die. Soft edge. Slight bleed on coarse stock. She handed up the printer's ledger showing March and May dies and the telegraph note refusing a 3rd die without the fussy edge. She asked who paid. The bank clerk read the line, Mill Patrons Club. The judge wrote private dies to mimic authority and underlined mimic. She moved to stamps. She pressed the notary's desk seal into scrap and set it between the die impressions. The deeper ring sat there like a weight. She asked the notary to read a line from his own book. Filed and recognized. Fee remitted by patrons. She asked for a statute that made a bond letter an instrument with force over a worker's schedule. He named none. He said domestic peace. The judge said the mail is not domestic. It is federal. The runner went next. Book first at 9:20, 3 days in a row. Family dispatch card tucked under the pouch cord each time. Federal lead tied with a clean bite each time. 3 fates for 3 letters. Fiancé into marshal's hold. Employer returned to sender under placard. Landlord into evidence with the shallow ring pinned on top. The judge wrote letter as lever, not notice. The photographer testified to the workflow without ornament. Expose the plate at the Union Hall. Scrape Union Hall off the cabinet card when the client demanded privacy. Press the wreath crest over the scrape spot with a hand press supplied by the notary. Donovan tilted the contact print toward the bench. The red thread tail showed at the screen hinge. The bench card's small bite showed at the edge. She set the studio curls Unai and on H on the blotter. The judge wrote deception of origin. The doctor opened his blank with boxes at the bottom. Seen, fit, observed. Donovan asked when he marked observed. He said when a steward or sponsor sat in the room. She asked if he had sealed blanks in advance to move the evening. He said sometimes. The auxiliary matron said it plain. Your seal ran ahead of your sight. The judge wrote seal before sight. The Union Hall steward tried to frame it as safety. He said supervised company prevented scenes. Donovan slid the coupon tally across and matched serials to the trust rack numbers and then to the bank's handling fee column. Coupon 47 redeemed, fee paid. Coupon 52 redeemed, fee paid. Coupon 61 pending. She did not use adjectives. She made him read the numbers. Money speaks a language a court understands. Vale took his turn. He called the bond modern protection. He said sponsors pledged not to redeem coupons in any unwholesome way. Donovan pointed to the landlord's unopened envelope and the landlady's unopened envelope. Both had reassurance of character on the outside, so a hallway could do the work. She asked Vail to answer a simple yes or no. If a bondholder refused compliance, would the trust write the employer anyway? He said yes for order. The foreman looked at the placard, and then at Clara, and then at the floor. The judge wrote order used as coercion. Will Pike gave minutes that matched paper. Lamppost flicker 9:48. Launch chain 9:52. Printer's side door 10:03. Men out without satchel 10:10. The printer's March and May invoices matched those hours in delivery notes. The bank clerk read handling fee times off the line, numbers aligned like a rail. The judge drew a small arrow chain on his pad. Launch, printer, die, mail, bank. The notary tried one more door. He said respectable patrons prevented worse outcomes. Donovan set the control envelope with the missing comma under the lamp. She asked him to read the Latin motto around the wreath. He read it with a comma his eyes did not see. She asked whether he had ever carried the wreath press overnight. He said the trust trusted him. She asked whether patrons had paid his fees. He said patrons supported order. The judge wrote private pay for public look and set his pen down. A landlord stepped forward unasked and put his unopened envelope on the blotter. He said the outer face had been enough to shift a curfew. A landlady added that the same outer face had told her to be flexible with a girl's door because domestic company might run late. The judge wrote coercion by outer text. The auxiliary matron set a church glove on the table. 2 faint red wax grains clung to the fingertips. She said one sentence. My closet is not for this. It traveled farther in the room than any speech. The judge turned to logistics. He asked the bank if the trust held bond funds in segregated accounts. The clerk said the trust ran a single patrons pool and paid handling fees from the same. He asked the mill whether wage deductions were opt-in. The foreman admitted they were automatic unless a worker objected in writing within 2 days. He asked how many objections had been accepted. The mill's lawyer said none. The judge wrote compulsory deduction under color of virtue. Orders and charges came next, clean and specific. First, immediate suspension of the trust's mail privileges pending indictment. Second, seizure under martial custody of the standard die, the travel die, the notary's desk stamp for testing, the hand press used at the photographer's, the steward's coupon tally, the clinic's blank slips, the printer's ledger extracts, the bank's handling fee column, the family dispatch cards, the copper tabs and brass loop, and the Union Hall curls. Third, destruction under martial supervision of the shallow travel die and any duplicates located. 1 sample impression to be retained with the case. Fourth, cancellation at the post office counter, with the word void across the face in red under witness of all bond registry certificates filed in the last 6 months. Subjects may witness cancellation under seal. Fifth, a public placard at the post counter. Not valid for mail, with a sample of the wreath crest and the phrases bond compliance and reassurance of character. So clerks and landlords stop treating outer text as orders. Sixth, audit of Mill Patrons Club and associated donor funds for purchase of dyes, wax, photographic services, handling fees, and any payments to stewards or clinics. Seventh, referral of the notary to the Commission for Discipline on seal before sight. The doctor listed as a material witness with his practice to be reviewed by the medical board. The charges read as statutes, not scolding. Extortion by post through bond compliance and reassurance letters. fraudulent use of private seals to imitate public authority on instruments conveyed by mail, tampering with custody of the mail via family dispatch cards and attempts to bypass scale and seal, conspiracy to assign custodial rights to time and conduct under false description of bond protection, attempted obstruction by commissioning a replacement die after a marked tool was identified. The judge bound Vail and the steward for appearance, set bond, and ordered the mill to accept written refusals without penalty and to refund automatic deductions pending the audit. The marshal opened a small iron dish. The shallow travel die went in. The judge nodded. The hammer fell once, twice. The die split with a dull sound. A clerk pressed the broken face into warm wax and clipped the impression to the chain of custody card. That single act did more for the room than any warning. The postmaster held up the placard, and the auxiliary matron signed as a witness to its posting. The photographer asked if he could continue to work if he left Union Hall on his cards and refused private crests. The judge said yes. The notary asked for his stamp back to close files properly. Denied until testing. The doctor asked if he could keep the office open for actual patients. Granted, with conditions. The foreman asked what to do with envelopes already received. Returned to sender under the placard. The landlady asked what to say to patrons who came with coupons. The judge said, "Say the word no," and point to the door. Clara stood and asked a single practical question. "May I witness void being written across any certificate with my name?" The judge said yes and told the marshal to escort her to the counter when the room adjourned. Will said nothing. He checked the wall clock against the depot entry and let his shoulders fall. Donovan closed the root the way she had opened it. She slid the standard die into its tin and clipped the fresh impression to the lid. She bagged the copper tabs and brass loop. She wrapped the contact print and labeled the frame. She tied the runner's ledger with blue tape. She placed the control envelope back in its flat tin. She signed the last chain card, read the time, and wrote it. 4:31. The judge added one more line to the orders, dull on purpose. Employers and landlords who act on outer phrases after today will be treated as participants in an unlawful scheme. The clerk typed it without asking for spellings. Outside, the hallway sounded like a city resetting itself. Employers left with returned envelopes and looked at the floor. The steward stared at his empty hands. Vail stared at the broken die. The auxiliary matron asked the postmaster for the extra placard offcut for the church wall. He said yes. Mrs. Hale told Clara they would go to the counter together. Aunt Meg put her gloves on. Will touched Clara's sleeve once and let his hand drop. Donovan carried the tins to the vault and did not put a second key in her vest. The clock on the wall did what clocks do when nobody tells them to lie. It kept time.